all that stuff on the side have to appear?
I will be able to move it.
I'm just curious.
I won't be able to add you and Rachel without it. So once for the viewers at home, it will not be there.
Oh, okay.
But for us, it will be there until like you begin your presentation,
Oh,
and then I
and then
can
just
full
my
screen
slides,
it.
so that my
Yeah.
slides will actually be bigger than what appears there now.
Mhm.
Oh, good. Okay.
Rachel, if you can hear me, just give me like a thumbs up real quick. Yay. Okay, so
It's a whole nother world
we're
out there.
gonna go ahead and do an intro, and then I will add you and Melissa to the presentation after that. Wonderful.
Go for it. Just get her done.
If you would be able to address this microphone.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Melissa Foley King. I'm a librarian here at the Hamilton branch of Enoch Pratt Free Library. Welcome to those of you joining us here today in person at the Pratt Library in Northeast Baltimore and our online audience on Facebook and YouTube for the GU272, the relationship between genealogical truth and historical perspective. This program is being supported by the Pratt's author and speaker engagement team, as well as the Friends of the Hamilton Branch Library. Our thanks to both. About our two speakers today, Melissa Ruffner, a native of Western Pennsylvania, came to the Baltimore area to attend Goucher College. A 1985 graduate of the University of Maryland Law School, she worked for the ACLU of Maryland on significant civil rights cases involving the right to education and racial discrimination in public housing. After serving as the director for a parent-run cooperative elementary school that she helped found, she earned an MLS from the University of Maryland College Park. She worked on library education and archival projects at Goucher, Hampton National Historical Site, the UMD University Archives, UMD College and Information Studies, and Drexel University. A board-certified genealogist since 2014, Melissa served as director of the Genealogical Institute on federal records from 2015 until 2020, and on the board of the Maryland Genealogical Society from 2012 until 2022, including 2 years as the managing editor of the Maryland Genealogical Society Journal. Since 2016, she has worked for the Georgetown Memory Project, tracing descendants of slaves held on Jesuit plantations in Maryland. Rachel L. Swarns is a journalist, author, and associate professor of journalism at New York University, who writes about race and race relations as a contributing writer for the New York Times. At the Times, Rachel served as a full-time reporter and correspondent for 22 years. She's reported from Russia, Cuba, Guatemala, and Southern Africa, where she served as the Times Johannesburg bureau chief. She has covered immigration, presidential politics, and Michelle Obama and her role in the White House. As a senior writer for the paper, she helped to lead and innovate on coverage of issues of race and ethnicity. In 2018, she joined NYU's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute, where she focuses on American slavery and its contemporary legacies. Rachel is the author of American Tapestry, the story of the Black, white, and multiracial ancestors of Michelle Obama, which traced the journey of Mrs. Obama's forebears from slavery to the White House in 5 generations. Her latest book, The 272, emerged from her reporting at the Times and focuses on Georgetown and the Catholic Church and their roots in slavery. The 272 was one of 24 books selected for the long list for the 2024 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction. She also serves as an academic advisor to the African American Civil War Museum in Washington, D.C., which is launching an exhibit based on her book about Michelle Obama's ancestors. She's appeared on national programs such as National Public Radio, PBS NewsHour, CNN, and CBS This Morning, and speaks to groups and audiences around the country. At the end, there will be a chance for Q&A, so please hold all questions or add them to the chat. Without further ado, our presenters.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you for joining us today during the last weekend of Family History Month. Who knew it was going to be a beautiful 80-degree day weather outside? So thank you for coming in and being inside with us. We're going to discuss the GU272, the large community of Jesuit enslaved Marylanders sold in 1838 to benefit Georgetown College. It's safe to say that both Rachel and I believe that genealogy and history work together to deepen our understanding of the past. And it's not just our intellectual understanding that expands, it's our personal connection to the people. David Von Drell, author of a book on the 1911 Triangle Fire in New York that killed 146 people, mostly young women, recently wrote that the challenge when writing history is to break the glass that separates us from the past, to connect somehow with those who lived before us and turn them back into people, not flat abstractions. They were flesh and blood, as real as you and I. Genealogy has come a long way from the days when the primary goal was to claim illustrious, mostly white, mostly male ancestors. Today's family historians collect more than names and dates. They seek to highlight the lives of all who came before us, especially those who could not necessarily leave a deep trail of records. We want to crack that glass. What we aspire to do, Rachel has done in the 272, and her readers are transported into the lives of the Mahoney sisters. But first, I'm going to do some nuts and bolts. You are welcome to take pictures or screenshots of any of the slides you see today. The work of the Georgetown Memory Project is meant to be shared, and I will have on my last slide a list of all the key links that I will be sharing with you today. In 1838, the sale of more than 272 men, women, and children enslaved on Maryland Jesuit plantations was authorized by Father Thomas Malady, then president of Georgetown College. The buyers were Jesse Beatty and Henry Johnson, who were seeking labor for their Louisiana plantations. The price was $115,000, $25,000 in cash, and the rest mortgaged at 6% over the next 10 years. And that translates into roughly $3.3 million in today's figures. It's thought to be the largest documented slave sale in American history. This transaction was just part of the large domestic slave trade in the 1800s, when millions of enslaved from the Upper South were sent further south. The sale proceeds were used to prop up Georgetown College, which was struggling at that time. Rachel will talk about the compelling and competing internal and external forces at work, but it should be noted that the enslaved themselves were well aware of the long debate that was raging within the Jesuit order about the sale, so they were living in fear and dread long before the sale itself took place. And the fact that this sale took place was not a secret. The records at Georgetown University are open. A history of the university published in the 1980s covered it extensively, and in the 1990s there was a great deal of academic research about it. But in the fall of 2015, student activism on campus reignited interest and outrage, especially as the university planned to rename two of the buildings for the men most responsible for the sale. Then the university president, John J. DeGioia, had a few months earlier announced the formation of a working group on slavery, memory, and reconciliation, and it was charged with addressing the university's history. The group included a large variety of scholars and community members, but no descendants of the families that were torn apart. Georgetown University, though, of course, is just one of many institutions that is engaged in this kind of self-examination. Oops, that's tricky. Georgetown alumnus Richard Cellini asked what had happened to the people who were sold and was told by one person they had all perished in the swamps of Louisiana. He didn't believe that, and he was adamant that more should be done to actively identify and locate descendants of the GU272. There could be no reconciliation without them. Richard, who has 2 degrees from Georgetown and lives in Massachusetts, had no previous connection or tie to this type of work. He was just struck by the omission in what turned out to be really a life-changing event for him and many others as well. He formed the Georgetown Memory Project, GMP, a nonprofit research organization in November of 2015. Its mission is to identify the people sold in 1838, locate their living descendants, acknowledge them as members of the Georgetown family, and honor their sacrifice and legacy. The GMP receives no financial or other material support from Georgetown University and the Maryland Jesuits. Its work is funded through individual donations and private grants. Judy Riffle of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, is the lead genealogist for the project, the bulk of which, of course, is in Louisiana. I live here in Baltimore and was hired in 2016 for Maryland research, and that's where my focus will be today. But I will tell you where to get information about the Louisiana families and research. One other thing Richard did was try to interest journalists in the unfolding story. And I'll let Rachel tell us later how that inquiry came to her. But her story, 272 slaves were sold to save Georgetown. What does it owe their descendants? Published on April 16th, 2016 in the New York Times, made a major splash and elevated awareness and the work of the project, bringing many descendant family historians into collaboration with us. And we've been working with Rachel ever since. In September of that year, the working group at Georgetown finished and issued its report. They announced a series of measures meant to address the history with slavery, including granting of legacy status to descendants of the 272. They issued a formal apology for the university's role in slavery. They changed the names of the 2 buildings to honor African Americans. And other plans included expanding its commitment to African American studies and the creation of a physical memorial on campus. I shared the mission of the project, but how do we go about achieving that mission? We study the genealogy of the Jesuit enslaved in Maryland prior to the 1838 sale. Understanding the family groups before the sale helps us recognize them after the sale. We searched for details about the 1838 sale. It was complex. It took place over a number of years, and the buyers and sellers kept up a correspondence about the terms and financing that often mentioned individuals who were involved. We follow the lives of the enslaved in Louisiana and in Maryland pre and post emancipation. So when you look at the whole picture, we are studying a community over a period of several hundred years up to the present day. We focus on the documentary trail, supplemented with family traditions that are brought to us by the descendant community. And we use autosomal DNA to confirm the trail or suggest new research paths. By itself, DNA evidence does not establish a specific connection. The Jesuits owned 7 large plantations in Maryland. 4 of those were involved in the sale, and they are marked here in red. The plantations were operated to support Jesuit institutions and priests. The northernmost plantation involved in the sale was White Marsh, where the main structures were within the borders of Prince George's County, but the acreage straddled the Patuxent River and included land in Anne Arundel County. Approximately 90 enslaved people there were listed on the slave census, which I'll show you later. It's located in current-day Bowie. Heading south to Charles County, we have St. Thomas Manor near Port Tobacco on a bluff overlooking the Potomac River, roughly 45 people involved there. And in St. Mary's County, there were two plantations, one at Newtown Manor, 45 people there as well, and St. Inigo's, really the largest group of enslaved, and that's all the way down near the tip, near Point Lookout. Other Jesuit plantations were in Cecil County and Harford County to the north, and Queen Anne's County on the eastern shore. As most family historians know, there's something very special about seeing and being in the places where our ancestors have walked. And many GU272 descendants have made these journeys. It's perhaps the first and easiest way to break the glass that separates us. This is the Manor House and Chapel at White Marsh Plantation in Prince George's County. The church there now is the Sacred Heart of Bowie. In Charles County, overlooking the Potomac River from Chapel Point, is St. Thomas Manor. And in St. Mary's County, also on the Potomac River, Newtown Manor. On the top left, you can see from the corner of the manor house how close the river is. Water, of course, was the main highway in the 18th and 19th centuries. St. Ignatius Church at St. Inigo's Manor now overlooks the Webster Field of the Patuxent River Naval Air Station. One of the key documents, and I mentioned it already, underpinning our work is a slave census compiled in preparation for the sale. It's an oversized ledger sheet. This is just a partial view of the top of it, containing 6 columns of names organized by plantation. It lists names and shows their age, and across the top are the headings: White Marsh Farm, St. Thomas Manor, Newtown, and St. Inigo's. Some family relationships are identified, but not all. Several people are associated with occupations, blacksmith or carpenter. It also records which ship, 1, 2, or 3, on which they were transported. At the bottom, there's a notation, 272 in all, but it is a bit more complicated than that. One of the things that we've been able to do over the years is refine the numbers. We believe that ultimately 314 people were involved in the sale, and I'll talk about the reasons for the different number in a few minutes. Of those 314, 217 were transported to Louisiana and 97 left behind in Maryland. Although their lives were not completely uprooted and they weren't exposed to the arduous work in sugar and cotton plantations, those left behind in Maryland were unquestionably devastated. It was commonly understood that those forcibly removed to the Deep South would never be seen again. Of the 97 we believe left in Maryland, we have found references in post-sale records to 24 of them. The other 73 are considered still missing, at least to our efforts so far. So these numbers are flat abstractions, but I will try to use actual names wherever I can. Oops, here we go. We have only one, let me go back here. Yep. You don't see the slip, save, something happened there. But what's behind that picture of the Catherine Jackson is actually a ship manifest, only 1 out of 3, and it's held by the National Archives in Fort Worth. And at the top, printed is its title is A Manifest of Negroes, Mulattoes, and Persons of Color taken on board the Catherine Jackson to be transported from the port of Alexandria for the purpose of being sold or disposed of as slaves or to be held to service. Let me go back, see if I can, nope, it's not there, sorry. So at the top of that list is Nace Butler, who was the patriarch of the family, and he's followed by his wife Bibby and the children Caroline, Basil, Martha Ann, Gabe, and Bibby Ann. The Butler surname does not appear on the slave census, but here on the ship manifest, they were actually given their full identity, even as their humanity itself was disregarded. The initial research focus, oh man, the initial research focus in Maryland the initial research focus in 2015 was in Louisiana. And the point of the sale was really to transport those people. So as I mentioned, Judy has traced about 217 of 314 in Louisiana records, but some just never appeared in the records there. For others, their absence was noted in subsequent sale-related documents without explanation. So when you look closely at the 1838 pre-sale census, you will find annotations added later. Here, under the White Marsh Farms heading, the second name, Charles, Isaac's son, is identified as a runaway. 12 names are marked that way. Below that, you can see the phrase married off next to Nellie's name. There are 24 people marked married off. And this brings us to the conditions placed on the sale by the Jesuit Superior General in Rome. Husbands and wives were not to be separated. If any slave, male or female, should have a wife or husband in someone else's possession, they ought to be joined together with all effort. Otherwise, they absolutely should not be sold with the intention of taking them to a faraway region. That meant that the spouse from the non-Jesuit owner had to be acquired or the sale arranged to a neighboring plantation and a replacement sent instead to Louisiana, which is why those numbers changed. The language surrounding the separation of parents and children was much less stringent than that of spouses, expressing only a mild preference that they not be separated. There were other conditions. The Jesuits wanted the enslaved to be able to practice Catholicism in Louisiana, more concerned with what they perceived to be their spiritual needs than their physical condition. They were not to be sold to traders or dealers, but directly to planters who would ostensibly keep them together. Sale proceeds were also not to be used to pay off debts. And we know that all of these conditions were compromised in major ways. The challenges of researching those who remained in Maryland are going to be familiar to anyone who researches enslaved people. Surnames are known for most, or unknown for most of the GU272 members and their spouses. The only surnames appearing in the slave census are Queen, Butler, Coyle, Sweeten, Cush, and Goff. Piecing together information from those ship manifests and post-sale records, we have expanded the list of 6 names to about 40 surnames in total. There's a big lapse of time between the 1838 sale and the 1870 federal census, when formerly enslaved people were enumerated for the first time. That's 32 years, really a whole generation, during a time when many life events were not recorded for most people, let alone the enslaved. And then there's the challenge of identifying people who don't necessarily want to be found. They may have changed their first or last name. They might have reclaimed traditional family names or put distance between themselves and the plantations where they are at risk. We know that at least one father from White Marsh took his children and came to Baltimore to live among the large free Black population. So what do we use to overcome those challenges? We pretty much use everything we possibly can. I struggled to make a list of sources that would be fun to look at, and I eventually gave up, but here are the main groups of records that we use. First, up in the upper left corner, at the Georgetown University's special collections are records that the Jesuits themselves kept, and they were relatively meticulous about tracking their money. Because the priests were at a distance from each other, they kept up a voluminous correspondence as well. So most of the sources known to be relevant to slaveholding have been digitized and are available to view and download at the Georgetown Slavery Archive. The link is on the slide there, but it's also on that last slide I have. All of the manuscripts and records have been transcribed there as well, and you can search across the whole collection. Special Collections at GU is also engaged in a massive digitization of all of the early Jesuit records. The second main category are government records created at each level, county, state, and federal. You can see the range that cover every aspect of an individual's life and events. Enslaved people, of course, did not leave their own records. Searching for them requires looking at records of the white slaveholding families, accounts, wills, inventories, and the like. And at various times, government agencies created records as part of their efforts to manage the lives of Black people. Published materials in that lower left-hand corner in yellow make up the last major group of sources. Any kind of research requires immersing yourself in what's already been discovered and documented, because you never want to realize that you've just discovered something that people already knew. But there is a cycle to this work. When clues are discovered, you return to previously checked sources from a new angle, and that's true for all of these sources. And that's why expanded digitization is such a big help to us. We have published at our website a series of research memos about our Maryland research, neighboring from 50 to 80 pages. In these memos, we list each of the 97 individuals, how they appear on the slave census, any annotations by their names, the circumstances, if known, of why they were left behind, and what we've learned about them. And all of that information has citations to the sources that I just mentioned. In the first memo in April of 2018, 91 were still considered missing by us. By the following year, we had only gotten that number down to 88. But last month, we published a second update with substantial new material. Bringing the number of those we can still consider missing down to 73. And we're still working at it. So we encourage anybody who's interested to download and distribute our work from the website. You can see the sources I listed earlier, how they're used, and perhaps it might trigger some ideas in your own work. The memos also include a set of clues to help you answer the question, how do I know if I'm related to the lost Jesuit slaves of Maryland, and what do I do about it if I think I am? We have partnered with the New England Historical Genealogical Society, Genealogy Society, NEHGS, at its American Ancestors website to publish family reports, a searchable database, oral histories, and other historical background information. It requires only a free registration with your email address. It's not behind the paywall. That was part of our agreement. We have identified over 10,000 descendants, both living and deceased. We do not publish the names of living people, but there are now 5,000 names in the database at this site. This is a major 2023 update over our original publication in 2019. And this collection of family reports and database includes members of the Louisiana GU272. I'm going to share a few examples of our process, but I have got some definite technical challenges here with my slides. Let's see if I can figure out how to recover from this. I think that I have a mismatch between my slides and my notes here. I will just tell you about Eliza, who was living at White Marsh, and she had 3 sons, William, Noble, and Edward. She did not appear in documents, but she was mentioned in a document that said she did not go to Louisiana, but did not say why. She wasn't listed as married off, but that was really kind of our best approximation of what had happened. And then we actually found a baptismal record for one of the sons, Noble. And so it actually identified her last name as Dorsey, and she was married to a Moses Taylor, who was enslaved by a man named Joseph Evans. And but I looked for them in the 1870 census, but of course I couldn't find them because 32 years later they would not be together. And so Judy Riffle, though, once we had the names, the new last names, she went back to the historic New Orleans newspaper collection, and she found an ad that Edward Taylor had placed looking for his family in the 1880s. And he described himself as the son of Moses and Eliza of Prince George's County. He said his parents had left him a long time ago. He named his brothers, William, Reverda, and Noble, and also identified a sister, Charlotte, whom we didn't know about, and she likely was born after the slave census was done. So we have no idea whether Edward ever found any of his exact family members, but we do know that he actually must have heard that there were former Marylanders in the area of Louisiana Maringouin, and that he went there, and some of his descendants actually married into several other GU272 families. So in some sense, he reclaimed some of his community. We did find an ad later that was placed just a few years after this sale that the Mr. Evans, who owned Moses, had placed, claiming that Moses had run away and had taken his wife, Liza, who was owned by another person, and they had no idea where they were. So that really supported Edward's claim that his parents had left him a long time ago and in Maryland. Rachel actually wrote a story about these old newspaper ads and how it's helping people these days find some of their community. Let's go to my other.
Do you want me to advance?
Yeah, I don't know what's going on here. Well, actually, yeah, if you advance for me, can you go? Is that the next one?
This is the next one.
Okay, it's another little pileup of images here for me. So I will describe this one. Sally Diggs was actually listed on the slave census as age 50, and it said she was married off. But it doesn't say, of course, to whom she was married. So what we found, though, was a letter from one priest to another, where it says Sally Digg, Aaron's wife, remained. Bishop Bowie, which was what a man named Walter Bowie was called, having refused to part with him. So that explains why Sally was left behind. You can see that it describes what happened to some of the other people. So let's hear their names. Isaac remained at White Marsh, as well as, but Nellie is gone with her husband, Peter. Joe, too, and his wife, Nancy. It's unclear from that, my reading right now, whether or not they stayed. But this is an example of a letter that shed, information about what happened to some of these folks. It turns out that Walter Bowie died the following year, or actually just a few months after this letter was written. And Aaron does appear on his inventory, valued at $1,000. And we know he was a carpenter, so he would have been considered a very valuable asset. But Sally, this is Sally here in the 1860 census, and she is found with Marjorie Queen and Robert Diggs, likely her son. And this is an example of what we call cluster research, where we find people together in groups. And the fact that they're with these other people allows us to confirm their identity. And in the case of people with the same names, to make sure that we have the right person. So we don't know how Marjorie, Sally, or Robert acquired their freedom, but since they did not appear in the 1850 federal census, we think it was sometimes in the 1850s. So she was living as a free person well before emancipation. So now let's see what your next slide looks like. How's that? So so again, Aaron actually, by the time of emancipation, was still enslaved by Walter Bowie, by the Bowie family, not by Walter himself, but by his descendants. And we know that because there's a group of records called the Maryland Slave Statistics. These records were collected in 1867 by virtue of a law that was passed by the Maryland General Assembly. the slaveholders in Maryland, they really wanted compensation for what they considered to be the loss of their property. So commissioners in each county went around and collected a list in 1867, so a few years after emancipation, say, what person did you enslave? What was their name? What was their physical condition? And it's a snapshot of what was going on at the time of emancipation. It's an extremely valuable set of documents for people who are doing this kind of research. They don't exist for every county in Maryland, but they fortunately do exist for the ones that I was researching. So Aaron remained with the Bowie family until emancipation, but I found Sally again in 1870, post-emancipation. She was actually living, looks like, on the plantation grounds at White Marsh with other Queen family members. And you can see the priests are right next door to her. And then we have these burial records for White Marsh Church. Sally Diggs, colored, age 76, was buried near that church that you saw a picture of at the beginning. Her age was reported in various ways over the years, but that's not unusual for enslaved people because they often would not know what their birth date was. Okay, I'm going to let you go ahead and do that. Okay. So this is a list of Butler family members. Nace Butler, we saw, well, you didn't see it, but on the ship manifest, you saw the Butler family had been shipped to Louisiana on the Catherine Jackson. And he stayed behind. He likely was already married to someone, and he is listed as runaway on the slave census. So he actually, I don't know that he was warned as some others were, but he stayed behind, which we can't even imagine what that would have been like. As you know, the rest of your family is being rounded up and put on ships. But he stayed behind, and we think he stayed in the St. Inigo's area. That a lot of times the runaways really didn't run far away. They made themselves scarce, at the time of when the ships came. So Nace was, unfortunately, though, he was not free in the way that Sally was before emancipation. Up until emancipation in 1864, he was enslaved on a plantation that was adjacent to St. Inigo's Manor, Cross Manor, and he was enslaved by a man named Dr. Caleb M. Jones. Now, this is his family, his wife, Eliza Ann, and his children, Henrietta, John, Robert, Ellen, Christopher, Walter, Susan, Alfred, and Nace, an infant, who was actually 1 year and 1 month. We could not find Nace, the child, in the 1870 census, so we believe he perished between 1867 and 1870. But Nace did stay in St. Inigo's and became a very significant figure in the community and a leader in what would have been called the colored community there. We've written a very long memo that's 14 pages long that's detailing why we think this Nace Butler is the one who is listed on the slave census, and that's available as part of that research memo that I talked about. And in that, we do the genealogical work we call a proof summary, where we do reasonably exhaustive research, we resolve any conflicts, we correlate the data and the people and the connections. He was very tight with the rest of the GU272 community, and that's one way why we're certain that it's him. And so he died, I think, in the 1880s, having achieved a certain elder, status within that community, but listed as a runaway on that slave census. This is a document actually from St. Mary's County tax records, because of course the slaveholders were all highly motivated to give report their holdings to the taxing authorities. They didn't want to be taxed on assets that they no longer had. Okay, let's see. I have an interesting feeling about this one. Okay. I wanted to introduce you to Louisa Mahoney Mason, who is also listed on the slave census as part of a family grouping. She was 22 years old. Her sister, Annie, who's 27, is listed just a couple of lines below her. Louisa is really one of our most well-documented enslaved from Maryland. She was warned by Father Carberry. She and her mother were warned by Father Carberry, who was the St. Inigo's priest who was most sympathetic to the enslaved. They were told to go out and hide in the woods when the ship came to get them. And so they did. And after the ship sailed, they returned to St. Inigo's and they were welcomed back by Father Carberry. Now, Father Carberry, having allowed Louisa to remain, actually had to buy her back from Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. And so that was dutifully reported to the St. Mary County Taxing Authority. We have a 1912 Woodstock letter account of Louisa talking about reporting that she had been warned by Father Carberry. And in language that's very hard to read right now because her family was actually very tightly connected to the Jesuits, may have worked right in the manor home with them. And this 1912 account, as you can imagine, describes really every black resident of St. Mary's County wanted to be one of the priests' Negroes because that was really an elevated status. We know that she was married to a free man named Alexander Mason, who was a carpenter who lived at St. Inigo's. He's enumerated there in 1850 and 1860. He actually was murdered in right before the Civil War. They never found out by whom, but she was, had a large family with him. And that might have been one of the reasons, if she was already associated with him, why she was warned when the ships were coming. So Louisa remained enslaved by the Jesuits until emancipation, November 1st, 1864, which, by the way, is a later emancipation date than in the southernmost states, because Maryland was a Union state. Their slaves were not freed until a little bit later. She had 5 or 6 children, and they're all listed on these slave statistics for St. Mary's County, which fortunately have been really critical to our work. And when she died in 1909, there was a huge obituary in the St. Mary's County Beacon detailing her life and her mostly, of course, her devotion to the Catholic Church and to the Jesuit priests that she served. She also is represented in the special collections at Georgetown University. There's a description of people who are buried in the cemetery at St. Inigo's, and at the bottom it says, Aunt Louisa Mason told us where the graves were. So clearly she was the institutional memory for St. Inigo's and the priests at St. Ignatius. Her family maintained really close ties to the Jesuits. This is a picture taken from a pictorial history of St. Inigo's. These are parishioners of St. Peter Clavers. And in it is a daughter of Louisa Mahoney Mason, Mrs. Josephine Mason Barnes. And Mrs. Louisa Mahoney Mason is identified as the last of the Jesuit slaves at St. Inigo's Manor. Now, her family has a very strong oral and written tradition of their connection. So by the time we were working on this, we weren't telling them something that they didn't already know. So the other interesting thing is that several of her grandsons were brought by the Jesuits out to the new Jesuit seminary in the Woodstock area of Baltimore County. So there's a large number of her descendants in the Granite Woodstock area in Baltimore County. And as I say, they're certainly well aware and have always been of their Jesuit connection. Also, DNA of Louisa's descendants matches the DNA of the Mahoney descendants in Louisiana. So she is, as I say, the best documented, but I feel like, we just know the barest facts. And this is really where Rachel's work, sort of bringing the Mahoney sisters, including Louisa, where she really does break the glass and makes us feel what it must have been like to be in her shoes. So this is some of the feedback that we have received from people that we've helped. In particular, you'll notice that they talk about how important it's been to their family. I mean, this is really important when you're doing the kind of work where you're trying to address the wrongs of the past. I mentioned that the descendants of Louisa Mahoney were very well aware. but oftentimes we're contacting people out of the blue. Some people have an inkling that they might be related to some of the GU272, and they come to us for maybe a confirmation. Their family's Catholic and they're from Southern Maryland. Other people, again, have no idea, and it comes as a big shock, particularly for the people whose families have remained Catholic all these years, to find out that the people that you have revered, were once your enslavers. And so in other times, though, I've contacted people and they have not really wanted to talk about it, or they think they want to talk about it until someone from the older generation sort of shuts down the process, because the trauma of slavery is very deep-seated. It's, I think, organically carried with people. And if you combine that with the older generation's sort of unwillingness to talk about things that are difficult, that's kind of a generalization, but that's often the case. The conversation doesn't necessarily get going. But this kind of work really elevates the resilience and the strengths of the ancestors of the people who are learning about this. And studies conducted over the last 20 years have shown that a knowledge of one's family history, even from just the recent past, strengthens the development of adolescent identity and is the single best predictor of children's emotional health and happiness. So that probably sounds like a genealogical sales pitch, and maybe it is, but if you haven't really started talking to members, older members of your family, now is the time to do so, because there's nothing quite as frustrating as that refrain of, if only I'd asked that question when I had a chance to do that. People do sense that understanding their ancestors helps them understand who they are and how they got to be here today. I think we all see those discussions at the end of Finding Your Roots, where people are just feel like they're able to synthesize the new information and sort of feel like they understand a little bit more about themselves. But the examination of the historical forces that impact, all of our families in the past really brings history into a closer focus. I certainly have felt like doing genealogy has improved my understanding of American history, certainly more than sitting in a classroom has done. Can you go to the next slide? So here are the key links that people at home, if they want to grab a screenshot, or if anybody wants to take a picture here. Maybe the most important thing is that here you can email questions to me at mruffner@gmail.com. I apologize for the technical difficulties I had today. I would have liked to have shown you some of the images, but I'd be happy to email my slides complete with all of the images that you didn't get to see to anyone who wants to see them. So if everybody has sort of gotten that, I guess I will turn this over to Rachel now to talk about her journey with the GU272 and with the Mahoney family.
Wonderful. So we're going to turn it over to Rachel. Rachel, I'm going to bring you in here. And if you would please unmute yourself, we're just going to test this out real quick.
Okay. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Can you speak once more?
Sure. I am.
We hear you loud and clear.
All right. Okay. I'm so happy to be here. It was great to hear Melissa talk about her work, which has been so important to families and to those of us who are writing about families. The title of this program, as you know, is The Relationship Between Genealogical Truth and Historical Perspective. And there's a lot of overlap between the work of genealogists and journalists who write about history. We both spend a lot of time poring over centuries-old documents, and we're all deeply invested in in-depth and careful research. I spent 7 years working on this book, and the research took me to archives and libraries in Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, to courthouses in Louisiana, even a historical society in New York. I tracked down records from the Jesuit archives in Ireland and in Rome. And of course, I've spent hours and hours talking to descendants who shared their stories and their family records. But the challenge for the journalist and for the historian, I would argue, is a little bit different from what genealogists face. Um, Journalists and historians are trying to use genealogy and archival research to bring history to light and to tell a powerful narrative. And that means that we sometimes look at the same information from different angles. It also means that we, as journalists, often look for documents and historical information that might hold little appeal to genealogists, but are critical for conveying vital history or are critical for storytelling. And for me, as a journalist, the story is critically important. So, what I'm going to do now is to tell you the story of how I got started on this journey, what I've learned, and what I think this history means for us as Americans here and now. And then I'll talk about the records and how I use them as a journalist. And after that, Melissa and I are really looking forward to hearing your questions. But first, the story. And whenever I talk about this book and this research, I always start by telling a story to help bring this history, these records, and these families to life for you, the audience, right? And to tell this story, I always need to take people, imagine from your seats wherever you're sitting, in the library or in rooms around the country. And I need to take you back in time, back to November of 1838, to the wharfs in Alexandria, Virginia, not far from where the nation's capital is right now. And if you had been standing there on the docks that day, you would have seen them. Scores of people being loaded onto a ship, forcibly loaded. There were elderly people, husbands and wives, children, babies. You would have seen frantic parents clinging to their children, babies wailing. Eyewitnesses described people falling to their knees, begging for mercy. And these were enslaved African Americans who had been sold and were about to be shipped down south to Louisiana, far from the world they knew and the people that they loved. And they had been owned, as many of you now know, by some of the nation's most prominent Jesuit priests, who also happened to be among the largest slaveholders in Maryland. And when times got tough, these priests did what a lot of people did at the time, which was to sell off their assets. And in this instance, we're talking about human property. 272 men, women, and children to help save their prized mission project, the college we now know as Georgetown University. And the priests were successful, the cash rolled in, Georgetown survived. It's now, as we all know, one of our nation's elite universities. But all of this came at a terrible, terrible cost. And scores of families were torn apart and almost completely forgotten for more than a century. And I came across this history in January of 2016 when a colleague of mine got an email, a colleague of mine at the New York Times, where I was still a full-time reporter and correspondent. She got an email from a guy by the name of Richard Cellini, who you've now heard about from Melissa. And he was pitching the New York Times on a story about, this 1838 slave sale that benefited Georgetown. And, this colleague of mine was intrigued, but very uncertain, because you have to remember this was 2016, right? The 1619 project hadn't been done. And newspapers at the time, as now, right, mostly focus on the here and now. And so it's really my great fortune that she didn't delete the email. And she didn't because she remembered my book about Michelle Obama's ancestors. And she thought, okay, here's someone who might know whether this is a story. And I knew immediately that it was a story. My work about Michelle Obama's family, her ancestors, had allowed me to explore how slavery shaped American families. And I could see immediately that this would be the next step in the kind of work that I wanted to do, which was to explore how slavery shaped an American institution. So I reached out to Richard right away. I gave him a call, and he, as you know now from Melissa's presentation, had gotten interested in this history because of the student protests in 2015. And he wanted to know, these buildings carry the names of two of the priests who had orchestrated the sale. Um, and he wanted to know the names were changed. He wanted to know more, and was told that everyone had died, which in fact only fueled his determination to know more. And I always think that there's so much that can be serendipitous about how history comes to light, how stories come to light, and you know. The fact that Richard felt firmly convinced that there was more to be found out really carried all of us on this journey. And Richard he's a white guy who had not been involved in racial justice or social justice issues, to this point. But he was a Georgetown alum who loved Georgetown, and he kind of felt like, Georgetown owed its existence to these folks. So we got started. I wasn't sure really how this would resonate with people. I was certainly really eager to write about it because it felt like urgent history to me. It felt like a way of understanding American history and how we got to where we are today. But how people would respond was unknown. And the story obviously ran in 2016 under the headline that Melissa described. And in addition to that story, we also ran a companion piece. As Richard and his team, Melissa and Judy Riffle and others, had been digging into this history, trying to find descendants. By the time that first story ran, there were a handful that had been identified, but we were convinced there were more. So the New York Times ran a companion piece, sharing the manifest of that ship, the Catherine Jackson, that departed in 1838 from the docks in Alexandria. And that's an important document because, as you may know, enslaved people often appear in the records only by first name. But this document, this shipping manifest, had first and last names. And so we share the link to that document and we asked people, do you recognize the names on this list? Are you Black and Catholic and from Southern Maryland, where the Jesuit plantations were located? Are you Black and Catholic and from Maringouin, Louisiana, where a lot of these folks ended up? More than 1 million people read that first article that ran in 2016. It was one of the most widely read stories at the New York Times in that year. Scores of people shared it on social media, and scores of descendants reached out to us, reached out to the Georgetown Memory Project and to Georgetown as they began discovering their ties to this very difficult and painful history. And I started writing more stories about this history. And as I went on, I realized that it was more than about Georgetown. It was really about the Catholic Church itself. And I started to ask myself, some of the questions as I started working on this book that had struck me from the very beginning. Priests enslaved people, priests bought and sold people. Why didn't I know that? Why don't most of us know that? Because as Melissa had mentioned, the Jesuit archives are right there. I grew up in New York City, where, the Catholic Church is known as an immigrant church, a northern church. And it's really no surprise, actually, that most of us don't know this history, because enslaved people have been largely left out of the origin story that is traditionally told about the Catholic Church. But here's what I learned in doing this work. Slavery was, in fact, foundational to the emergence of the Catholic Church in the British colonies and in the early United States. Priests who enslaved people and sold people established the nation's first Catholic archdiocese, the nation's first Catholic cathedral, the nation's first Catholic institution of higher learning, Georgetown. Priests who operated and sold plantations and sold people established the nation's first Catholic seminary. So the very underpinnings of the Catholic Church were established by priests who relied on slavery. And so in writing this book, I was confronted with a challenge in thinking about how to tell the story. Again, a difference between a journalist and a genealogist is that really we're trying to engage with our audience and bring a story to life. How do I bring this history to people? And I figured out early on that, 272 people were sold, scores of families, but I would focus on one. And I tell the story of the Mahoney family. And I start with the matriarch, a woman by the name of Anne Joyce, who arrives in Maryland, which you may know was established in part as a refuge for Catholics who experienced discrimination in England. She arrives, and she's a Black woman, and she arrives as an indentured servant. And many of you know about indentured servants. And, she came with her contract, her term of years to work, and then hoped to go on her way, as many European indentured servants did. But she came at a time when the economy in Maryland was transitioning from one that relied on indentured servants to one that relied on enslaved labor. And her contract was burned. She was forced into slavery, and she loses everything. Everything except for her story. And she tells that story to anyone who will listen, the white people around her, her children and her grandchildren, and her descendants tell that story. And it's a very simple story, which is that our liberty was stolen and we should be free people. And her descendants resist. She has descendants who kill an overseer and are executed. She has descendants who take the Jesuits to court, file lawsuits to try and win their freedom. Only a few are successful. I tell the story of Harry Mahoney, who saves the church's wealth during the War of 1812 and is rewarded with a promise from the Jesuits that neither he nor his children would ever be sold. And that promise is broken in 1838 in that mass sale that ended up selling many of his children. So right about now, you're probably asking yourself a question that I asked myself, which was, how did priests justify this? How did they defend this? And the answer is that the priests were complicated. Unlike some white people who viewed enslaved people as brutes, almost as animals. Catholic priests did not view them that way. They viewed them as human beings, and human beings with souls, and with souls that needed to be tended, and souls that they had an obligation to tend and to nurture. At the same time that they felt that it was okay for them to buy and sell their bodies. Slavery, of course, was legal. And Rome did not condemn the buying and selling of Black people. There were condemnations of the enslavement of the indigenous, for instance, but not the buying and selling of Black people. And so they remained almost completely silent about that. And so what are we talking about in terms of conditions? In the archives, I found records that documented the whipping of pregnant women, children sold without their parents, a girl swapped for a horse. In the 1820s, there were descriptions of slave quarters, and they described that people were housed in shelters that were, quote, almost universally unfit for human beings. Archbishop John Carroll the nation's first archbishop, in a letter kind of exemplified what could, only be described as the extreme callousness that was demonstrated sometimes by these priests when he talked about how they could, work down the debts of a plantation or some of the plantations that were in debt. And he describes the possibility of the sale of, quote, a few unnecessary Negroes. So that gives you a sense of what we're talking about. I think, though, that it's really important to know, too, that all along the way, there are priests who raise questions, who raise concerns, priests like Father Carberry, who Melissa described to you briefly, who even protested, for instance, this 1838 sale. I want to tell you about two of them, and it'll give you a sense of the spectrum of opinion. Thomas Milady, who was an early influential president of Georgetown in the 1830s and an important Jesuit leader at the time, is an important figure. He was a member of the generation of American-born Jesuits who were sent to Rome for education and brought back to be leaders of the Jesuit order and the Maryland province. And he, like a couple of the folks I'm talking about in this generation, knew slavery up close because he had family who enslaved people. And he was also something of a visionary. He thought that the future of the church did not lie in this plantation system, this rural countryside-based church. He thought the future was up north. It was in the cities. He looked and could see the waves of immigrants pouring into the cities, Catholic immigrants, and said to himself, that's where the future is. And of course, he was right, but he was willing to sell these families to raise the money to try to do that. Father Carberry, on the other hand, was a priest, also American born, also had family relatives who were slaveholders, but he had a very different um, idea of the people who he saw and who were enslaved at St. Inigo's. He saw people with capacity. He saw people with faith. He writes in a letter about an enslaved man who builds a windmill and marvels at the craftsmanship. He actually institutes an experiment on his plantation where Jesuits are always complaining about the enslaved people not working hard enough. Carberry thinks maybe we should pay them. Maybe they should get some of the profits. And so he divides up some of the land on the St. Inigo's plantations, gives families acres that they can tend themselves, and arranges for them to share in the profits. And when an Irish Jesuit priest, a senior leader from Ireland, comes in the 1830s, he marvels at the difference from the plantation, how it was. He had seen it back in the 1820s. And when word came about this sale, this mass sale, Carberry had people in the community, white and black, praying that it wouldn't happen, and also went to Georgetown to protest himself. And when it seemed that none of those things would work, as you've heard, he urged some people to run. This is a very difficult and heartbreaking story in a lot of ways, but it's also really a story of resilience and family and faith. One of the things, the sets of records that are so important, particularly on the Louisiana side, are sacramental records, because many of these families, after emancipation, when they had a choice about where they would worship, chose to stay in the Catholic Church. And the sacramental records end up being really important kind of guideposts for people who are trying to learn more about these families. It's not that Black people, all of Black people stayed. They didn't. Many thousands of people in New Orleans left the Catholic Church because it was segregated. White people took communion first, seating was segregated, but many of these families stayed. Not only did they stay, but some became lay leaders. There are even a couple who became religious leaders, and they worked to make the church more reflective of and responsive to Black Catholics, which is really important. Okay, so that's the story that I was trying to tell in the book that I wrote, the 272. And I want to tell you now, and to wrap up with a bit to return to the records that I used and some of the similarities and differences. Here are some of the records that I use that genealogists don't typically use. So, from things like almanacs from the 1830s that told me about the trees when they blossomed or floods when they happened to bring kind of settings and scenes to light, newspapers that described the types of businesses that were open near the wharf where the people were sold when they were walked to the ships, what they would have seen around them. The Jesuit records, as I mentioned, and as Melissa has mentioned, are so important. A diary, for instance, that described the death of one of Louisa's young children, a boy by the name of John. Court records were actually really important. Court records that describe the execution of Anne Joyce's descendants, for instance, court records that described an insurrection that took place near St. Inigo's in the around 1817 and involved some of the free people, free Black people who lived on the plantations. Um, I mentioned those lawsuits where some members of the Mahoney family sued the Jesuits. Those were really, really important records. People sometimes say to me, "Oh, how did you end up focusing on the Mahonies?" And truly, as you know, scores of families were sold, and there are scores of amazing stories to be told. But it really came down for me as a journalist to the records. And those lawsuits, you may know or not know that enslaved people by law and by practice are barred from being able to, read or write. So letters, journals, those kinds of things, which are so important to historians and folks who write about this period of time, are really hard to come by. These lawsuits, though, described had which still exist. They're at the Maryland State Archives. You can read them yourself. And the depositions of the people who were interviewed as part of this court process, descendants of Anne Joyce describing the stories that she had passed down, white people who knew her or knew of her. It really allowed me to it was almost 100 years that those records gave me, from her arrival in the late 1600s to when these lawsuits were filed in the late 1700s. Super, super invaluable. Also, financial ledgers. Again, sometimes these are useful to genealogists because they include some of the names and sale prices of people, which details about them. But for me, again, part of the thing that I was learning and trying to track was how slavery fueled the growth of Georgetown, of the Catholic Church, and these financial ledgers with dollars and cents over time were really important. I want to wrap up because we really want to hear your questions with two examples of records that we both use, genealogists, Melissa and I, genealogists and journalists, but use them differently. So the two sisters, Louisa and Anna, both have children, and Judy and Melissa have documented the family line, as Melissa said. The Mahonies are quite well documented. And Louisa and Anna, the two sisters, both have daughters. But for me, what was important was not only, who the daughters were and when they were born and when they died, but was also that these sisters happened to name daughters after each other. And that to me said something about the relationship between these two sisters who were torn apart in the sale. Another example, and the last example that I'll give was their brother Robert, who is shipped out on the Uncas, the ship earlier than Anna with the Catherine Jackson. He's shipped out over the summer, and again, an important document, both for genealogists and for journalists. But for me, what was really important in seeing that and knowing that, okay, this family is already, there's a important family member who's taken in the summer, and this sale happens where Anna, the two sisters are torn apart, happens in November. It just allowed me to sit for a minute with what that must have been like for a family. Losing your brother in that way and knowing that you might be next. And so, with that, I will wrap up my part, and I am looking forward to hearing any questions that you might have.
So, can everyone in the room hear me? Cool. And then I'm also just speaking to our virtual audience. So we're gonna have about 15 minutes for Q&A. Whatever questions are asked here live, I'll just repeat into this microphone so that anyone watching online is aware. Especially if you want to address it to Rachel, because she can't really hear everyone here. So let me go ahead and cue everything up. And for those watching virtually, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. And then Melissa, since you're here, you're welcome to kind of select who asks what questions.
Okay. Are there any questions? Yes, Linnea?
Well, I wondered if you had any thoughts about how this work and the repayment, if you will, that Georgetown University paid to the descendants might be used as a model for other institutions that bought and sold people in a larger context of American society.
I think we're gonna change this, and I'm just gonna walk the microphone around. So
I heard that question, but maybe for viewers.
wonderful. I think if Rachel heard it, then you all can go
Yeah.
ahead while I untangle this microphone cable.
I'll just start by saying Georgetown has not made any direct payments to any descendants.
Provide tuition.
No, they have granted legacy status to descendants, which gives them a slight leg up in an admissions process, in a selective admissions process. They have done, I think the Jesuits have done some funding of projects that are more community-based in Louisiana. And also, I think that some Georgetown funding, I know, funded a recent descendant reunion in Southern Maryland. So that was another example of the kind of work they're doing. But direct cash payments, I don't think have ever been on the table and are unlikely to be. Rachel, do you want to?
Yeah, I can give you a sense of what Georgetown and the Jesuits have done. Georgetown, as Melissa mentioned, became the first major university to offer preference in admissions, essentially legacy status to the descendants of the enslaved. I should say that both institutions, Georgetown and the Jesuits, apologized, for their involvement in enslavement and in the enslaved trade. Georgetown has set up what they describe as a reconciliation fund. They are raising $400,000 a year, and that money is going toward projects that benefit descendant communities. The first grants went out this past spring, and the Jesuits have partnered with a group of descendants to establish a foundation. The Jesuits have promised to raise about $100 million, again, to benefit racial reconciliation projects that would benefit descendants. It's the largest effort by the Roman Catholic Church to try to address this history, but fundraising has been slow. Georgetown and the Jesuits both kicked in a little more money recently. And as Melissa pointed out, no no money is, going, directly to descendants. So there are descendants who have certainly said that they feel like that's something that should happen. And it's a large descendant community, so there have been many voices and many opinions about what the institution should do.
Are you going there? Okay.
I'd like to know, I was late, so I might have missed it. Do you have, is there any record of slaves that might have been born in other counties in Maryland and rounded up in Charles County? And the reason why I asked, I have a heavy butler on both sides of my family from Kent County.
Oh, Kent County.
I was curious about that.
Well, Kent County is on the eastern shore, so it's possible they could be related to people who were held at, at the Talbot County or something like that. But this is what we usually say to someone. I'll give you my email address afterwards, and I'd be happy to look at your family tree or get your information, and we can see whether or not there's a connection.
I just also want to add
Uh-huh.
the area where my family is from.
Yeah.
It's called Butlertown.
Butlertown.
And it was a segment on a recent PBS
Oh,
Kent County, you know how they do different counties. So it was a feature in a segment.
Kent County their historical society down there is doing a lot of good work right now. I had reason to look at that recently, and they are really focused on African American heritage in Kent County. So I'd be interested in helping you explore that if you could. The Butlers, it's a very large family, lots of butlers. But if we could find a connection, I'd be happy to help you. Was your family Catholic?
Well, actually, I do have a branch of my family
Mm-hmm.
that's currently Catholic,
Okay.
but as far as historically, I don't.
Okay. Okay. Mary?
While they were slaves, were they offered the sacraments? Were they encouraged to take part in the Catholic sacraments?
Well, I know that they were married by priests, and those were recorded, in sacramental registers. I'm assuming that because one of the conditions of the sale, of course, that they wanted them to be able to practice Catholicism, what that was that they would have taken communion, Rachel, if that's what you mean by the sacraments or
Thinking of like communion,
baptisms.
confession, all
All
the
the-
different confirmation.
I believe that they definitely participate in confirmation. I've seen lists of confirmations, I think.
I think it's interesting because it was it was really variable over time. There are priests who complain, for instance, that about enslaved people who just aren't really religious and aren't participating in the sacraments. There are actually there's an awful story from the 1700s of a priest who, because to punish a couple that was had infidelity in their lives, sold the children. But there are also instances where you had enslaved people who were clearly very devout, and really there's a lot we don't know. There are kind of practical reasons to be practicing and devout, whether you really were or not, because it was something that the priests valued. But we do know that obviously many of these families embraced the church themselves, truly did, because it remained a faith for generations.
Hi.
So I'm from Charles County,
Mhm.
and from the Queen and Cozy family background, and I'm in contact with some of the members of the GU272 organization because we're showing on Ancestry documentation that we're related. And one of their big concerns, and I'm wondering if Georgetown is doing anything to address this, is that in some of these cemeteries, in particular, I'm thinking of the one closest to my family's homestead in Bryantown, Maryland, there's a colored cemetery and a white cemetery, and quite literally, the colored cemetery gravestones are being swallowed up by the earth. And so the ability to go back and trace this, to maintain this, and to do this history, they have a feeling, rightly so, that it's slipping away, like before their very eyes. So I'm wondering if Georgetown has any intent of helping some of these, the archdiocese as a whole of DC manages all of these cemeteries to do something to stop this or to remediate that. That to me would be a great use of these grants to kind of preserve that history.
I haven't heard of a project like that, but to me, like just as you said, it sounds like a great project for some of these grants. I think it does sound like a great project for some of these grants. Um, and but I haven't heard of any specific effort by Georgetown or by the Jesuits to deal with that. But that does seem like an important thing, especially in terms of finding out more about these
Can I
families.
just stop for,
A quick follow-up though, is there a way to apply for a grant or suggest a grant or to make some kind of recommendation?
Yes, there is. And in fact, I can send the information to Melissa, and we can share that with you.
I think it might be dependent on the community around the church. I know at White Marsh at Sacred Heart, there's really a large effort underway, and they're working with the group that manages all the Catholic cemeteries in the Greater Washington Diocese. And they're engaged with an archaeologist who's trying to identify, additional graves and figure out whether there are more people buried there than there are markers. I just wanted to, someone posted that they could not hear the question, and I just wanted to say for that person that it was a question about decaying cemeteries and places where there are colored cemeteries, quote unquote, colored cemeteries next to white cemeteries, and that the colored cemeteries have a great deal of decay and are slipping away in terms of the stones and the condition of the ground itself. So that's what that question was about.
This might be anecdotal, but it appears to me that the further south you go, those cemeteries are worse. As you get closer to the DC and metropolitan areas, they seem to have some sort of knowledge that there's importance in this.
And generally, like a better awareness of.
I think so.
Okay, that's interesting.
I could pass off the microphone for the next question.
I just wondered if you had any obstacles to your research on the part of Georgetown or the Jesuits. Was there any pushback? Did you ever find any sort of roadblocks put up in front of your research on the part of the institution?
As I mentioned, the Georgetown had even before the protest at Georgetown, the student protest at Georgetown in the fall of 2015, Georgetown had decided to try and grapple with this history. They put together this working group to try to do research and to try and figure out steps that they could take to try and address this history. So they were thinking about this and thinking about doing this work even before Melissa and Richard and Judy came into the picture, before I came in the picture. Having said that, I would say that if you're a journalist and you're calling an institution and saying, hey, I'm writing about your ties to slavery, that is usually not like, people aren't cheering on the other end of the line. And I can tell you one funny story, which is that I think maybe it was in 2017 when I got an anonymous email from someone at Georgetown saying, there are more records and they don't want you to know. More records. And so to be honest with you, I have no idea whether that was true, whether Georgetown didn't want me to know. But certainly these records were really important. These were boxes of financial ledgers that had not been cataloged up to that point. And the general understanding of The sale was, up to that point, was that Georgetown and the Jesuits had only received the down payment for the 272 because these buyers had financial problems and were never able to pay the full amount. These ledgers were invaluable because they showed, of course, enslaved people were property, and people bought property on an installment plan, even enslaved people, and it documented kind of year by year the small payments from Maryland buyers and larger payments from these larger buyers that continued all the way up to the 1860s, and money that also went to some other colleges and institutions, Jesuit colleges, to help support their emergence. And interestingly, in one of those records, the 1838 sale, we talk about that a lot. It was the biggest one, but people were bought and sold all along the way throughout this history. And they're what we describe as the small sales in the 1830s, when the priest, Milady, who I mentioned, wanted and was pressing Rome for a mass sale, but wasn't getting permission. And so they start selling small groups of people, which they can do without permission. There are pages that are missing from that financial ledger, which is, and very neatly not there. And when I looked at the ledger, I said, oh, wow, those years in this ledger in the 1830s when, some of these small sales were happening, those pages, and they're like, yeah, we noticed that. So how that happened, when that happened, I don't know.
I would say that my access to sacramental registers, which is important to me for tracing families, has improved in the last few years.
And they've made some real efforts, right, to help you,
to help us specifically to get access to records. But churches, the records belong to the individual churches if those churches are still in operation. So, they sometimes have to be persuaded. And they're very protective of people's privacy. The Baltimore diocese actually entered into an agreement to have all their records digitized, and anybody can search them within those privacy, periods of time. But I would say that the Washington diocese is for financial reasons, they say, a little further behind in that regard.
And I would say that actually there is a group right now, because Melissa just jogged my memory about this, of an effort by Catholic dioceses around the country to try to digitize these records that relate to slavery and to enslaved people. In fact, there's a meeting in St. Louis, I think maybe just this week, where a number of archdioceses are getting together, archivists connected to them, to try and talk about this, because they understand that these records are so important to families. So that work, I think, is very important.
Deborah?
This is our final question of the day.
So I was wondering if there is any effort underway to spread this knowledge amongst other historical groups within the states, and also within Maryland and Louisiana for sure, but also amongst the other states. Because I was just looking at the Charles Carroll of Carrollton Museum, and they don't mention the word slave anywhere. And I thought, well, that's an interesting omission. So I was just wondering if there's any future effort underway, or if people at Georgetown are already speaking to people about increasing public knowledge of this history. Thank you very much.
Of this particular sale? Well, we're doing events like this, where we try to, but we are in touch with and we distribute our work. We have developed a pretty broad list. But we do. I've gone down to certainly St. Mary's County and represented, the project. I'm usually looking to connect with other descendants. But if you're talking about other institutions, I think that this is. I've been contacted probably, in the last 4 or 5 months by 3 or 4 different organizations that are seeking to do this kind of work. So I think it's becoming more the norm than the exception in terms of this self-examination. And I know at Hampton Mansion up in Towson, they've long been looking at this issue and have really worked to publish that history, the history that they have, which is, kind of similar in terms of the number of people involved. Goucher College is another place locally. And I don't know about the Carroll Mansion, whether they need to be jogged or, but I do think they know about it. So I think, but I do think it is kind of spreading. And the more you talk about it, to people that and value that kind of activity, the better off we'll be going forward.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to everyone who attended in person and to everyone who's here virtually. Like Melissa said, everyone is welcome to reach out to her if they have any other information that they're looking for.
Would you like me to repeat my email address?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay. mruffner, RUFFNER @gmail.com.
And I will also go ahead and put that in the comments. So anyone
Okay.
who gets to check out this video in the future, it'll be there documented.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. And we will all say goodbye to Rachel. Bye, Rachel.
Bye, Rachel. Thank you.